with the highly anticipated and now officially confirmed 28 years later movie scheduled to be released in June of 2025, the entire world now is seemingly buzzing at the overall possibilities of what this movie might introduce, especially if it is successful enough in introducing a trilogy. As joining me now to talk about the overall pros and cons of what this movie might end up introducing, along with possible scenarios of an outbreak, is one of my good friends and fellow YouTubers that goes by the name of Marcanine. Now Mark, me and you have talked about this behind the scenes a lot, especially as of recent, and I think you already know my position on all of this when I say that I think that 28 years later is going to literally bring a new life into the zombie franchise, right? And the reason why I say this is because we've seen a proven track record before with 28 Days Later, with 28 Weeks Later, and how they basically went on to inspire an entire generation by introducing the infected / running zombie aspect of things, right? And now that we're getting 28 years later, which is pretty crazy how they should have, I think in my opinion, called it 28 months later, but that's neither here or there, because what's more important, I believe, about this overall movie is kind of finding out what happened in between the events of 28 days, 28 weeks, and what I wanted to ask you, as well as everybody that's listening and watching this video, is how do you think this outbreak, how do you think this potential third outbreak, because this is going to be the third outbreak, of course, we've seen the first one in 28 days, and then the second one in 28 weeks, which only brings me to the idea that there is going to be a third outbreak, so I'm kind of under the impression that maybe the rage virus probably died out over time, right? Unless, of course, it just so happened to have mutated, but there needs to be something different, I think, in this movie that desperately needs to kind of introduce something unique and different that doesn't really feel forced in a way, and so with the potential for there to be a third outbreak, perhaps maybe transmitted by animals, maybe a shadow government somewhere, or maybe coincidentally having to go back to the original, maybe have some organization let it loose by accident, right? It's a little hokey to kind of revisit that, but the possibility of that is there, which I don't want to personally see. But if you had to create somewhat of a circumstance or scenario to maybe introduce another larger infection spread or something of the sorts where the outbreak then begins to kind of spread out throughout Europe, maybe into the Americas, I think it should come via the idea of perhaps maybe the rage virus still living on within animals, because we've seen them in chimps in the first movie before. So what I wanted to ask you, as well as everybody else first, is what kind of possibilities and scenarios do you see kind of more or less be introduced in this upcoming movie that would actually give us a unique and kind of, I would dare say, new variant or version of what a mutated rage virus would be like if it spread this time for a third time?
I honestly don't think, and I'm saying this as a huge zombie fan, as a lover of all things undead, I don't think we are going to see anything in this movie in terms of how the infection gets out that we haven't seen before. I'd be very surprised if they found some unique way to make it spread that wasn't stupid. The common ways are there's some sort of corporate greed, they want to weaponize it, they experiment on it so they can try to do something to contain it. Maybe there's a twist, they release it on purpose and they're trying to destabilize the economy. I don't know, like we've all seen that shit before. Like all that stuff has happened before. Maybe some scientist brings his kid to work and the kid's playing with a vial of BS that he shouldn't, you know, because the parent's neglectful, not paying attention, and the kid knocks it. Like there's just so many different things. An animal can spread it, a kid can spread it, maybe there's like a military vehicle, you know, that flips over and it you know, spreads that way. Like, who knows? Regardless of how it comes out, that doesn't really matter to me as much. I'm not expecting something innovative, like, in regards to how this gets exposed to the world. Really, like, from a zombie perspective, like, I just want to see more of what made 28 Days Later so special. And for me, I really, Cillian Murphy's acting was fantastic. I love him so much. This franchise is what kicked off his career. He's even attributed that as much, you know, even though he may not necessarily be in the next movie or the next trilogy as a whole. I don't know. He's producing it, so he believes in it in some way. But I will say that I just want to have a good, compelling story. I want to have something that feels fresh, you know, and I would say that 28 Days Later as a franchise seems to me like a franchise that did start things off a little bit more unique in that it's zombies, but like not really. Like, yeah, it follows the same principles, infections, bites, crazy attack, you know, maybe eating you, whatever, like, you know, the world is in jeopardy, like all those certain things, but like it doesn't follow the exact same rules. But I feel like the drama is what's equally as important. Like when we're first introduced to Cillian Murphy's character in 28 Days Later, when he wakes up, like, you know, out of the hospital and like there's nobody around, that's nuts. And it reminds me of like Rick Grimes in The Walking Dead. And while The Walking Dead kind of subscribes to your typical zombie scenarios, undead, corpses, whatever, apocalypse, the world's over, it's gone on for so long, both in comic form and in live show form with many spin-offs that it makes you wonder, like, what else is there left that could be done? You know, like, what else could you do, like, with that franchise? And I'm not saying that there aren't things that are new, but I'm saying, like, you're picking up a franchise, like, when did 28 Days Later come out? 2002? You know, so more than 20 years later, literally, you're picking up a franchise that should have had a third movie entry in it, like a decade ago, at least. Like, what are you doing now? Why after all this time do you have a trilogy, like, ready to go? Like, how much time was spent planning and thinking about this? Like, was there other projects in the way, or was this something that's just always been cooking? Like, were you waiting for people to finance it because nobody believed in your product? Like, I don't know, like, where they want to take it and, like, what they want to do or what we haven't seen. We've seen Resident Evil type zombies. We've seen, you know, obviously what's in 28 Days Later. We've seen that in 28 weeks. We've seen zombie romance in Warm Bodies. Like, we've seen so much with The Walking Dead, which is, like, sort of the pinnacle for your classic typical zombie. 28 Days Later is different, and then it's like, these are just human beings that are infected that can die off after starvation and stuff like that, and they're not, you know, the same type of walking corpses. You know, they run, they come at you. I feel like that's a lot of what we're attributed to Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead as well, you know, which was an exciting, horrific film in its own right, especially because it introduced the concept of running zombies, which is pretty freaking terrifying, you know? Those sorts of zombies are just as terrifying because they could be corpses that just live forever. So, I mean, what are they going to do? Because in my mind, I'm just thinking, like, if you have an entire world that at some point knew of the existence of this particular virus from both the events of 28 days and then the events of 28 weeks, and you know that this particular virus and the infected who cannot be cured will die off in 2-3 weeks or whatever of starvation, in that you could just stay home for that long and, you know, all the threats would essentially be gone. Now, I know that they're a little smarter. They can run and open doors, and they have sort of some semblance of their humanity, which makes them more dangerous than your typical zombie because they can sort of think a little bit. But at the same time, like, they've survived this before. So, like, what exactly is going to be new? What exactly is going to happen here? Like, is this going to be something where, you know, they want to have, like, I have my ideas of something they could do that would be new, but, like, doesn't make it good. So I'm very curious. I'm excited that Danny Boyle's a part of it. I'm excited that Garland's part of it. You know, that means that there's going to be something good happening here. But that doesn't mean that I'm fully, like, free of skepticism, because it's been a long time. Why has it been so long until now that you're finally ready to make this movie? Like, what do you have in store for fans? Like, what is the deal? And how do you bring in new fans? You know, this movie's 20-some years old. Like, I don't know.
And you see, now that's a little interesting because I feel as though the way this outbreak needs to kind of start is important, because I, for one, am definitely a fan to kind of see more of a grim, dark, kind of dreadful film to which maybe the humans stand absolutely no chance of winning. I think by having, this time around of course, by having the entire world be infected, by having this element be introduced where all hope seems to be lost, right? Because in every single movie, we've seen how the heroes emerge victorious somehow, and I think for once, it'll be very interesting to see if they end up doing an entire trilogy that at least one of these movies ends off on a note where the zombies, or the infected in this case, win. I think that'll be a very good call to kind of have the audience thinking like, oh, where do we go from here? What do we do now? And I think that by having, you know, Cillian Murphy's character return, that's going to be crazy, because a lot of people have often wondered, hey, where has Jim been this entire time? Does Jim know about the second infection? Was he maybe preparing for a possible third infection? Even though he's nothing special, he's not really a soldier, he's not really someone that has superpowers or anything of the sort, he's a common guy. I think that by having one of these movies kind of set the tone to not only reintroduce his character, but to kind of establish that the infected are so, I think, deep in numbers and so much more effective in what they were doing, that it makes the other two movies look like small fry compared to what they're able to do now. And so I want to kind of pick your brain to kind of understand and see where you kind of stand on a position which you can kind of explain to me more or less on how you think this will go. A good circumstance versus a bad circumstance, I guess, or maybe a good scenario versus a bad scenario. I think that, to me, one of the worst case scenarios that could end up plaguing this movie is if they kind of feature more human drama, if they don't really, you know, kind of go as far as to shed light by, you know, maybe introducing an element to where the rage virus evolved, because we know how every single virus tends to mutate and evolve over time. So I think that would be be interesting, but to kind of fall back to say, okay, well, the rage virus hasn't evolved, we haven't learned anything since, those times, I think that'll be really bad. And I think that by having the humans just body all of the infected would really be dumb too. I would love to see what they would do if they upscale the amount of infected and even went as far as to spread all throughout the world. So I guess if you had to kind of narrow it down, what would be some of your best and worst case scenarios here?
Okay, so let's say that Jim shows up at some point. I don't really know exactly what he would need to show up for. He's not involved in special forces. He's not the type of guy that where he can really attribute or do anything involving the virus. He's just a guy who survived it that we followed around. That's really all there is to it. He's not some special guy that knows the secret to the cure. He's not Brad Pitt's character in World War Z, which I also didn't like that movie, by the way. I thought that was really dumb. But I do think at some point, if they were to say that there's, maybe a new character we're following around ends up running into Jim or something like that, which it would be hard too, because Jim was maybe in his 20s and it's 28 and he's in his 50s now. Cillian Murphy doesn't exactly look that old. They could probably age him. I don't know how you introduce Cillian Murphy's character back into it if it's 28 days later, or 28 years later rather. But I will say, I think it would be interesting that you bring up that we should wipe out the entire population. I think you could do that. But that also removes hope. And I feel like I don't want to see the good guys always win, because it's not necessarily about that. I mean, real life isn't so, obviously this is zombies, right? It's not exactly real life. But then again, COVID was a few degrees away from an entire, zombie thing. It could have been. But I think real life is rarely so simple. It's rarely as romantic as good always prevails. That's not how it is. It's so true that you can make all the right moves and still lose. Jean-Luc Picard. And I feel like there's no way to make anyone feel like if they just keep trying, if they just keep working at it, they'll survive. And I feel like movies have a tendency to always try to make us feel good because they're trying to invoke a certain sense of feelings. But you don't want to leave the movie theater after paying for a movie that you've been looking forward to, feeling like shit. You don't want to leave the movie theater feeling wow, I just loved all those characters and they're all dead. That kind of sucks. You want to be left with the sense of maybe, but you just don't know. And I think that's the difference between the Dawn of the Dead movie. I remember that now, Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead at the very end, they run into a bunch of zombies. But I left the theater thinking oh, they could survive. They might. But if the novelization and if Snyder came out himself and was no, they're all dead. It's okay, well, that's kind of bleak and boring and sad, disappointing and whatever. I want to believe somebody survived. Fun fact, so, this reminds me of Shaun of the Dead. So, Shaun of the Dead, one of my favorite movies of all time. It's a comedy zombie thing, but it's still, it still counts as a zombie movie. So, if you watch the DVD commentary, they talk about the different characters in the movie that actually survived. And one of them is Diane. They named her Di because she supposedly dies. But in the DVD extras, Simon Pegg talks about how Di actually manages to escape the zombie horde that she runs into after David gets ripped apart, and she hides up in a tree and eats David's leg, because she, remember, as David gets pulled apart in that movie, she grabs onto his leg because she's just delirious and going nuts, and she sees that he's dead and she just can't believe it. So she grabs his leg trying to pull him back in, but she ends up keeping his leg. She uses that leg to beat back the zombies, get through the horde, climb up a tree, and survives for days up in this tree, nibbling on pieces of David's leg while the military comes out and clears out all the zombies. We don't know that from the movie, because the movie didn't show us that. We just assumed she ran into the horde and she was dead, and that was all there is to it, but we don't know. But she actually survived. I feel like there's something that you could do that here, possibly, leave it open a little bit for interpretation. But if it's a trilogy, there's a specific story that's probably trying to be told. So maybe that doesn't work so much. But I would think that, as I mentioned before, a sense of irony, 28 days later sort of begins with the suspense and the drama of Jim coming out and seeing nobody on the street. It's just him and his lonesome on the streets in London or wherever, and he's just what is going on? Much like a Rick Grimes scenario, sort of, right? You don't know what's happened. You just know it's bad. What if, at the very end of the trilogy, Jim somehow gets involved in the story in some way that makes sense? I don't know. There's got to be a good way to do it. And instead of wiping out the entire population, it's just Jim. The very end of the movie, as far as the audience knows, Jim is the only person left in the entire world. And it's just him with zombies that are all around. Maybe not swarming his door. Maybe he's not in immediate danger, but he knows that something has happened where the last of human civilization has fallen and collapsed, but he's been living off off the grid, and he's just kind of like doing his own thing. And when we see that he's like the last human to survive, and that's where the trilogy ends. I think that would be kind of interesting because it's the concept we were first introduced to that like drew us into the story, because it was just so cinematic seeing one guy all alone in the world, and then it's like, okay, no, there's people alive, but they're all in hiding. Now it's like, no, the trilogy ends, and it's like, this is just the last man all by himself, and that's it. And that's all that you do. I think that would be an appropriate way to do it, because I don't want to see every character I like dead. That doesn't really invoke hope in me, you know? And I don't know about you guys, but like when I'm watching zombie movies, I'm taking freaking notes, dude. I want to know like when the zombie apocalypse eventually happens, because it will happen. COVID is proof that we are very close. The next time we get a new like little pandemic thing, it's zombies, dude. I'm telling you. And I've got my survival bag, I've got my machetes, I have everything here that I need to be prepared for. So if this movie's going to introduce concepts that we've never seen before, you best believe I'm taking notes, and you best believe I'm going to be prepared. So I just want to see, like, how does the last guy survive? Because if everybody dies, then I've got this backpack sitting right next to me for nothing. My rations will go unused. Keep in mind that we've done everything that we feel like we could do before with all those similar elements. Now it's time to do something different and try a whole new set of characters and not have any connection to legacy. Like, let's just start fresh completely and do something different, because that way it's now unexpected. You have no idea who the killer is, what their motivation is, what they're after, and you also, as an audience member, you can't guess as to what's going to happen next, because everything's already been done before in the past 7/8 movies. That's the direction I would like to see it in personally, but you know, who knows? Everyone has their own taste.
No, absolutely, and I think that's what makes this franchise so interesting, especially now after finding out that there is going to be a rumored trilogy, if of course 28 years later actually ends up performing well. And so the possibilities, just like I've stated during the beginning of this video, are almost seemingly endless, but it's also very interesting because they would have to go about by figuring out this formula to make things feel different or to feel fresh and to tell a story that we haven't really seen be done before, or at least even if we did, for it to be kind of unique in a way, you know. But even with that, we want to go ahead now and get your thoughts down in the comment section below on your overall expectations, what it is that you guys want to see as well. And on top of this, do you guys potentially believe that 28 years later is going to maybe in fact actually reinvigorate the franchise of the undead once again? So once more, thank you all so much for watching, everybody. Thank you all so much for your time, to which once again, if you also just so happen to be new to this channel, then I do encourage for you guys to head on over and smash that subscribe button, on top of giving this video a big fat thumbs up by smashing that like button down below. Tune back in for more, and with all that being said, I want to thank you all so much for watching. Mark, thank you so much for joining me, and we'll be seeing you all down in the comment section below and in the next video. Take it easy, everybody. Peace.